Good afternoon. Please keep enjoying your lunch. And a warm welcome at this kind of diversity series. As you know, we have at the Institute a committee on diversity, and one of the outcomes of the diversity committee is to create a speaker series that was inaugurated this fall. I'm very happy that today we have the second installment. And very, very happy to welcome Shulamit Kahn here, Associate Professor at Boston University's Questrom School of Business, where she has been since 1987. Is that correct? I hope. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. Too long. No. Here at the Institute, we have faculty members that have been here since 1948. So. Exactly. Shu's work focuses on labor economics and human resources, but more recently it explores the careers of scientists and examines gender differences in the academic sciences, biomedicine, economics, and social sciences. So as part of her research, she's also studying the contribution of foreign PhD students to global knowledge, creation and diffusion, entrepreneurship and innovation. She's the author of numerous articles on gender and academics, women in science and economics. She earned her PhD in economics from MIT, and prior to her career at BU, she also taught at the University of California at Irvine. She is the chair of the Questrom School Faculty Policy Committee and chair of the Board of Trustees for a vocational school in Kenya. In today's talk, Gender Bias in Science, Where Is It and Where It Isn't, she will present evidence and lead a discussion on how gender stereotypes and attitudes about math and science are learned in kindergarten and criticized during puberty, and how these stereotypes can affect careers. And she will also bring evidence on gender differences in STEM mobility and gender bias, or lack thereof, in education, academic careers, and salaries. Now, I hope, and I think you already know, this will be a very interactive session, but there will definitely be a Q&A period. And of course, after this, we'll we have actually an opportunity during tea time to have a further discussion with you. So I hope you join me in a warm welcome, Shulamit Kahn.
Thank you. So why was I asked? I'm not sure, but one reason is that in the past 2 years, I've kind of written 4 different review articles of what is known about women in science. And so with my co-authors, and so I just want to see it. There's the pointer. So that's one that got it started. This is a recent one in Economics Dictionary, and there are 2 others that haven't come out yet. And I've also done a lot of research of my own. I use secondary data to kind of analyze what's happening. A recent one here is on NIH grants and gender. I'm just talking about gender. Something a little older, but very important because we haven't come back to it yet. We're waiting for better data, is Does Science Promote Women? In a National Bureau of Economic Research book. Something about, these are just a few of the things, of engineering bachelors and whether they continue in engineering, and if not, why not? And most recently, almost most recently, I published an article about postdocs, which is not about women per se, but postdocs is an incredible hurdle to women in going into research biology even after they've gotten their PhD, so it's important to women. And here's a bunch of other things that I've written. A lot of them, the early ones, are in economics because I started being interested because economics seemed to me pretty bad. And I guess you had Sarah Jane Leslie, and she said philosophy is bad. So I think the 2 of these fields are, between them, some of the worst in terms of gender representation. So I thought I would start with ancient history here, actually, which is, this is from the early 60s, I think. Obviously, historically, things were very different than they are now. You could advertise jobs for men, jobs for women, female help wanted, 6 men wanted, male help wanted, and gender was a big thing. We have come a long way from that. So if I say that it's not so bad, that gender equality, that sciences are not so bad, to the extent I say that, it wasn't true before. But what I'm telling you is what's happening now as opposed to the 60s and 70s when my mother-in-law could not get a job as a sociologist because she was a woman, an academic job. So where am I coming from? I'm an empirical economist. Um, I view my job as identifying facts particularly about relationships. I try not to let my beliefs influence my findings. In the field of gender, a lot of people do let their beliefs influence what they find. And so I try to be as objective as possible. And what do I like to, when I'm looking at the review, what do I like? Well, obviously I like the more observations, the better. So is this really representative? But as economists, I know that causality is really hard to prove. Experiments are the best. Natural experiments are the second best. A natural experiment is something like in one of the articles I talk about, people get grades from a blind grading nationalized test, and they get grades from their teacher. So if you compare that, that's perhaps a natural experiment. But I myself end up using a lot of multiple regression, trying to control for all possible confounding factors. And it's not perfect. It doesn't always get causality, but it gets a lot closer than just plain old correlations between two things. Okay, what's gender bias? What do I think? I think it means you make choices that are not based on evidence. In general, that's what I think bias means. To me, it does. And often we think about the choices that are made by others. However, I actually think that in terms of women in math, a lot of it is the bias you hold about yourself. And so that's where, after kind of thinking about it through 4 different review articles, I've decided that this is the worst. And the problem is that some of these biases are self-fulfilling. So if I think I can't learn math, I really can't learn math. And if my teacher thinks I can't learn math, she's going to teach me differently and less abstractly and kind of at a lower level. So it's because the biases affect what happens that makes them pernicious. And I think you could probably give me other examples where gender STEM bias is self-fulfilling. Anybody have something they want to suggest that they know about? Otherwise, you could think about it and come back to it later. Okay, come back to it later. Okay. And the problem, of course, is when a bias is self-fulfilling, what's first, the chicken or the egg? When infants play with, boy infants play with trucks and infants play with dolls, is that due to the bias of the parents, the bias of the toys they're given, or is it something hardwired, or what is it? Is it a preference that's hardwired, an ability what is it? So it's very hard to tell the difference between cause and effect, which is why and particularly in this area, I'm not sure we can, but what strikes me is when you see something changing, when it starts not biased and becomes biased, that I think is the strongest that we can get. Okay, so these are my main conclusions, and if you can read them fast, great. Each of them will have their own overheads. So I first talk about the underrepresentation. I then talk about the timing of when things start, and I think that starts during kindergarten and firmly set by high school. And I talk about how they kind of are self-fulfilling. I do describe gender differences in math ability, but I show that they're very, very changeable and mutable. This is just something I recently believe, but there's not enough research. I'll give some evidence. You don't really need to be at the far, far right tail of the distribution to have a successful STEM career. I talk about preferences. I think that we can't ignore preferences. And nor can we ignore women's early biological clock because they affect choices that women make and men make. And I'm going to talk about, this GEMP is math intensive. And in math intensive subjects, which some of you are in tenure track academia, there's not as much bias as you think. However, for economists there is, for philosophers there is, and also for what I call LPS, which is life sciences, psychology, and social sciences, sometimes more generally. Okay, so let's first do the, and that's where I'm going. First, let's do the description of underrepresentation. You probably know all this, but I have the pictures already, so why not give them? So, in fact, women these days are not so underrepresented in science. So they're 57% of BAs in, I think, 2014, and 57% of STEM BAs. So that's pretty striking. However, okay, first of all, it's a huge increase. And so you can each find your fields here. Huge increase in every single field. For instance, this is psychology. Psychology started, pretty high and went. But this, of course, is engineering, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, engineering also started high. So all fields are going up. There's been a huge increase. But I do also want you to note the increase has stopped in college, mostly. And particularly, it stopped very early for computers. Computers are kind of their own thing. We all know about Silicon Valley. And actually, economists, it stopped pretty early, too. But for the rest of them, it stopped around the year 2000. It stabilized in bio and psych, which are the top two, at really high levels. But it's not still growing. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to divide from now on, and I use this in our articles, fields into two kinds of sciences. So one we call GEMP for geoscience, engineering and economics, so there could have been two E's there, math and physical science. Those are the more math intensive and the less people-oriented fields versus life sciences, psychology, and social sciences. So the latest numbers that I could find are that women receive 24% overall of the math-intensive GEMP bachelors, but 69% in life sciences, psychology, and social sciences. That's that dichotomy. You can't throw all sciences together. They're really different, and I'll show lots of ways in which they're very different. So science is not one thing. Okay, questions? Okay, we're going to move to PhDs in a second. So I always like a picture of a pipeline. Does the pipeline leak at every point, even after you get it? Not necessarily, and this is starting with bachelors. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the underrepresentation. Okay, so the underrepresentation is only in the math-intensive GEMP and not in the life-intensive. But what's interesting is the proportion of who go on for PhDs. Okay, and so this is the estimated percentage of people like who got their BAs in 1992, or to 96, who get their PhDs a certain amount, I don't know what I put in, 7 or 9 years later, who have a PhD by then, and et cetera, for the two-time periods. And what we see is that fewer women, certainly in the 90s, fewer women than men went on to get PhDs. Let's see if this, yeah. So in the math intensive, more recently, the difference between men and women has really narrowed. And this is the first evidence that things are not that different in some of these math intensive sciences once you go into and get a major in them. Okay, so these life sciences, life psychology, social, they're lower to begin with because a lot of people who do these majors want to go on into health things and medical school, and particularly women. But you would not say that this difference has narrowed over time. And particularly, I don't know, so you would not say that. So in the math intensive, things are narrowing, men and women are becoming more similar, but not so far in the other ones. Okay, let's look at PhDs. Almost half, in the 40 percentages here, 44% in 2014, of STEM PhDs are held by women, which is a huge, and you'll see this a continuous increase because it started at 9% in 1970. That's amazing. Okay, and here when I say continuous, they didn't peak as much, certainly not in the early periods. They haven't peaked nearly the same amount. You will notice that life sciences have peaked, and all I can say is these women are smart because there are no tenure-track jobs in life science compared to the number of people who are getting those degrees. But we can talk about that later. But otherwise, in all these other fields, it's been really going up. Women now are the majority in the life sciences, psychology, and social science fields together, much less so in the GEM fields, in the math-intensive ones. And then what about going from there to academic tenure track? I think it's pretty striking that if you're in a math-intensive field, you are just as likely, if you're a man and a woman, or a woman, to go on to a tenure track job. But if you get a PhD in the life sciences, psychology, or social sciences, if you look at the difference between men and women, the difference has gotten much bigger in the likelihood of going on to get a PhD. So, I mean, going on to get assistant professor tenure track job. So in the life sciences, things aren't getting better. The gap is widening in who goes on to academia, tenure track academia. Not so in the math intensive sciences. Those are both insignificant. Okay, why the GEMP underrepresentation? And these are the math intensive, these are the thing rather than people-oriented fields. So this is my second and third points, which is I think it starts really early. And I didn't come to this, I came to this by looking at everything. I think it starts very, very early, but it doesn't seem to start until you get to school. School is the socialization that teaches girls they're not good in math, and teaches boys they are. So, beliefs that boys are better in math start after children enter kindergarten. And you heard this from Sarah Jane Leslie the last fall. And the actual differences in math abilities are not there in the beginning of kindergarten. So some economists went and they measured them at different stages. They are not there in the beginning of kindergarten, but by grade 2, they sure are. So here's the article that you know about, that at age 5, when you first enter school, boys and girls equally associate their own gender with really, really smart people. But by age 6, boys associated their gender much more than girls did. And this, I could go through it, but you've heard that paper before. So that's really interesting that the socialization of kindergarten is changing things. These are the economists, some are economists, some are not, who've done this. They enter kindergarten with similar average math scores, but a male advantage appears by the end. It starts appearing at the end of kindergarten, and by second grade, it's clearly there. So something has happened in this socialization that teaches girls they're not good at math. And then guess what? They're not good at math. Very early on, Eccles and her co-authors found things similar about boys feeling themselves more competent. And there's a new literature that doesn't start early enough that I know of about high school. It's not all that new, but it has to do with, do you think you can learn math? And this is really crucial. Do you think you can learn math? For sure, by the time high school comes, girls do not think that they can learn math. That math is learnable. Not that they can't, but that math is learnable. And this is something else I know you learned about Sarah Jane, but this starts in high school very clearly. Some people call it growth mindset or incremental, about can you learn this subject? These are all U.S. population. I'm going to give you some ability things that are not, but most of the stuff that I've seen about with these experiments are in the U.S. It's an excellent question, but most of the things that I've seen are in the U.S. Well, I'm going to compare some of the, I'll show you some comparisons of ability, because the ability reflects this, I think. Do you know what I'm saying? That literature, I don't know anybody who's done it in other countries. Whether you think you can learn math. I don't know of anybody who's done it in other countries. But I think when you see in Iceland, the gap being so small, it's got to be, they believe, or maybe in Finland, I don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. Yes, they have. And in fact, in the first article, well, I'm not sure. Let me think. Anyway, everybody, reading, girls are better at. Girls think they're better at, girls are better at reading, which is the two subjects you might get in early grades. So the opposite is true. Okay. So now let's look at some of the ability differences as measured by a variety of different things. And here I do get a little international. And what I see is that it's incredibly mutable. It changes from country to country. It changes from state to state. It changes over time. Okay, so just to review things, we look at two things when we talk about math ability. We look about where's the middle, and so kind of, if you think of this as a schematic thing, the belief that's based on a lot of fact is that females have a lower average and they are less spread out. Okay? But this picture is not accurate. This is the accurate picture based on actual data. It has the same kind of overall pattern, but what you are really struck with is the brown. The brown is the overlap between men and women. By far, by far, by far. Most, men and women are in the same range in terms of, this is math scores in tests, standardized tests. It's true that green is only females. There are more women in the middle. And at the very edges, both edges, there are more guys. The orange is the guys. So at the tippy top, there are more guys. In the middle, there are more women. And maybe the middle is different, and we'll see it is different. But it's very hard to tell from that. Because the difference in average math ability is tiny compared to the spread. You can't even see it there. Where's the top, the mode of those? Okay, so I like this one because he goes, these guys go every grade. So this is the same NAEP test, what a lot of people use in the US when they're just comparing in the US. And here you see grade 2, which is where we left off at the end of, after I said it starts early, by grade 2 it's there. Positive means boys are better at math tests than girls. It's definitely there by grade 2. And 3, but if you notice that it disappears in grades 4 through 8, girls are better in grades 4 through 8 at the average, but then it reappears in puberty. So I also see from the literature that when you get to high school or middle school or high school or around puberty, things seem to be pretty set, which is to say,
If those are in standard deviation, why shouldn't I read the left column as saying there's no difference, the pattern you just described is just noise, like these numbers, these effect sizes are so small that they're meaningless?
the reason is this is at least 200,000 people. So this is,
I agree,
it's
it's significant.
significant. But you're right, in terms of the, what we call, because we're very, in my class, in my field, we think we own everything. We call it, they're not economically significant. The difference in the average is not. It doesn't really have a lot of meaning. But it is interesting that they change. And I don't think it's just random. Because a bunch of studies will do grade 2, grade 6, and they all find it depends on what grade they pick it up. Now, some people find that it changes here. They found it changes in 10. Other people see it changes by 6, 7, or 8. I think it's more like puberty is where it changes. But I think it's real. That's why I love this study, because it's hundreds of thousands of tests. Now, the averages, first I'm going to talk about the averages. The averages change a lot over time. That's in the 2000s that you saw. But in 1972, things were very different. Okay? So this is a different, this is the same one because this is the 0.06 that you talked about. So you can see that things changed a lot between there and there at the high school level. And one thing, and I guess I say it in a different one reason is that in the period of the 70s and 80s, girls started, and the 90s somewhat, girls started taking more advanced math courses. So the message, girls need more science, kicks in. Here's some international comparison, which is to say, this is around 2003, same test, an international PISA test taken, that you see that for some reason, and I don't understand the different countries well enough, for some reason, the difference is very large in the Netherlands, but in Iceland, girls have the math advantage. And what's interesting is that those two countries are both kind of European. They're different, very different. And here we are right in the middle. So that's fascinating to me, how different it is internationally. And people have said, is this correlated with countries' gender attitudes, so their gender stereotype attitudes indices around countries? It's generally correlated, but it's not very tightly correlated. But there is some correlation that could explain it.
So the Netherlands is a pretty small country. Are there U.S. states that exhibit such huge differences as well?
Funny, you should mention that. Let's see. Let's go here. So different people looked at different states, and they found the South, which also has different attitudes, which I'll say right there, norms are is different than New England. And in the United States, again, look at Asians versus whites. I mean, clearly that's some kind of a cultural impact. If in the same states and countries, controlling for other things, Asians and whites are so different. And what I missed, okay, so let me go back because that's different. So that was averages. I just want to say now I'm doing top tail. Because what we saw in the Hyde et al. Here is that the variance of boys is always greater. Okay? And it's both at the top and the bottom, but particularly at the top. So there's a skewness in there as well. So, but that's average, and you've seen that. But this is top tail. Now, this is the cream of, this is really top tail. And that has changed a lot from 13.5 to 3.8 in terms of the ratio of how many boys per girl in that top. So sure, it's still higher. way higher than 1. And yet, if it changed so much, it kind of tells me that a lot of this can be changed and is not so biological. Now, having said that, there hasn't been improvement since then. And that is attributed to a great extent to girls taking an advanced high school math. Okay, and here, this is the top tail. It's not as a elite top tail, 1%, 5%. We saw that fact. And is it due to norms? So that's the evidence that I'm bringing to you today about ability. I will say a very fascinating study that shows you how stereotypes affect ability a little bit. And I like this study because it's a natural experiment. So it was about Israel, which is a different culture, sure. Okay, but what these guys did is they compared, and they're not both guys, what they did is they compared the scores between written tests, standardized tests that are graded, by a machine and national tests versus the teachers' grades based on the tests they give. But they figure the teachers' grades are affected by how they think of the person, perhaps. And they use that as a measure of stereotyping, of the teacher stereotyping. And they show you, so this is the 0. They show you that this is the 6th grade English teachers. You can see that the more people are on the left of the black line. The left of the black line means that they think that they give girls better grades in English. English is not their native language. In English than boys. But for math, teachers, and this is both male and female teachers, are more likely to favor boys, give them higher grades than their standardized tests say they deserve. So this is a measure of stereotype bias. These are randomly assigned teachers, by the way. You can't choose the gender of your teacher or anything like that. And what they have found is that these biases from 6th grade have long-term effects because they affect whether you take advanced math in high school, which is very important for doing well in high school and going on. So this is like the cleanest experiment that I know that show that stereotypes really make a difference. Teacher stereotypes, particularly, in changing, because they give you more boys, more positive reinforcement. Okay. I do want to talk about, there's hope. We were talking, is it kind of permanent? There is hope. There are interventions that can be done at various different times that will take people who think they can't do math and get them to do better. So, for instance, the math gender differences change if you pose a problem as a math problem or as an art or design problem. So it's not that they have this different ability, it's that they either turn off for math, the girls, or they like the art and design better, and they kind of concentrate on that more. So there's been a few interventions where it was experiments for this group. They gave you tutoring and told you, about math and, but they didn't, but this group is different. They tutored you, but they also told you that math can be learned. And they convinced the students that math can be learned, this growth mindset, and it made a difference, particularly for minorities, but also for women to some extent. So thinking math can be learned is very important and can make a difference. You can intervene and change that even in high school. I don't know if you know this study. SAT used to have you say your gender before the test, and then girls did worse in math. So they changed it to after the test. Girls do better. Not better than boys, but better than they would otherwise. It actually affects how they do if they're kind of primed to that stereotype. And there was a lot of people doing stuff about, oh, little girls can't do spatial rotation, infants can't, there's a problem. So there was an intervention of teaching new engineering students, especially the girls or whoever didn't feel they were good, just having a short course in spatial rotation, and lo and behold, that incredibly narrowed the differences in their subsequent engineering grades, because they never learned these skills. Okay, this one, there's less evidence, and I'd like to have more evidence, but I can understand why this is not easily available, because you don't find out easily about how good the students are at math and then what happens to them later. But one of my co-authors, or two of my co-authors who are at Cornell, got a sample of their graduate students and looked at their GREs, or got all their graduate students and looked at their GREs. These are in some of those math-intensive engineering types, physics, and now actually in economics these days, you have to have perfect scores in your math GRE to get into a good economics program. Having two daughters who did have perfect scores, that was necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, but here in all of these math intensive, you did not need the top score. And these are people in top universities, graduate programs. It'd be nice to have more data on faculty and what grades they had in high school. That would be lovely. No, this is, sorry, no, the math, I'm sorry, the Q is for quantitative. Sorry. Yeah, it's there, it's just hiding. Okay. Now that's all the evidence I know about this. I'm happy to learn more from anybody, and I myself think about what data could I get that will teach it to me. Okay. I do want to talk briefly about preferences and about childbearing. Preferences. I think you cannot ignore that men and women like different things in the end, in terms of science. So Eccles, who I mentioned before, did some early work on it. They found that boys and girls clearly had different preferences at very early ages. Some recent economists have done this work. They interviewed people about why they chose a college major, and the main reason is, I like learning it, and I would like the job that I would do with this degree. So their preferences were dominating why they did it. They weren't saying, oh, I'm good at it. They said, I like it. So preferences are there. And there's a huge literature in psychology about this people-thing dichotomy, which is to say, some people are, and I've done the Myers-Briggs, I think you see that a little bit in there too. Some people are, social, and some people are, S and N. I don't know if you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs test. But here it's like, some people are people-oriented and some are thing-oriented. And it seems there's a gender difference in the distributions of whether you're people or thing-oriented, various different ways they measured it. Recently, some economists were surveying people about whether they like their jobs and why. And women said, oh, I like this job because I can use my brain. So women seem to love using, now this is not just scientists, this is all people, because if I tell you what men like using brawn. But women like using brains and working with people. So that's not just scientists, but I think it's a general thing that people have seen about preferences of men and women. Just like there's that truck doll infant dichotomy, which one are you going to, who plays with what. By the way, I was there when Larry Summers immolated himself by talking about how boys and girls were essentially different and couldn't do math as a result, or couldn't be good at math as a result. And he basically said, well, my sons play with trucks. And there almost does seem to be a truck gene. Now, the question that I have is, I'll come back to that. I said, is this learned? Is it something that from the toys? Is it biological? I recently saw something on public television that says you can do PET scans from high school or older, or brain scans, and it looks like their brains are different. They cross the boundary differently. But other people say, yeah, but you don't see that in kindergarten. You only see it later. So lots of interesting things happening. But by the time you're adults, it does seem to be that, for sure, that women on average are more people-oriented, and here we see also brain-oriented than men. But I guess what I feel is, well, I see that every day. I'm a labor economist. I am not a finance economist. I like people, not things. It doesn't mean I use different methods. We're both using the same econometric methods. It just means that I tend to focus my research on people-related things rather than things-related things. And so what I think about this people-thing dichotomy is you have to take it into account. It really explains a lot about why women are in biology, and that doesn't mean they're only in non-math. A good friend of mine's daughter, she is computational biology. They could be very math-intensive, but it's about people in the end. And so there does seem to be a difference, but you can be in STEM and do people-oriented things, or like I do, using numbers, or thing-oriented things. And this is my controversial part. So I actually think part of this difference is biological. Just I believe it. And why I believe it is the higher incidence of being on the autism spectrum for men. So I talked about this, Josie. So I'm just putting it out there. Here's an example. Dilbert, certainly on the autism spectrum, saying, yay, I have another full day of doing nothing but rearranging zeros and ones. You know it'll be a good day when there's no human interaction on the schedule. And then she walks in, how's your day doing? Well, it started good. So if you don't, this is the thing. He likes interacting with computers, not with people. Who's not good with people? People on the autism spectrum. So it's not surprising to me, and I think that if autism is biological, there's some part of this preferences, the thing-people preferences, that is biological. But it doesn't mean you can't do science. It doesn't even mean you can't do math. It just might mean you'll do math for different reasons or applied at different things. And you will tend to, and I know that we have women do tend to go, like in economics, but in everything, less into pure theory and more into things that are applied to stuff that they could, that actually affect people. So that's my proof of the thing-people interactions. Okay, so some gender differences are due to women's biological, yes? Right. No, to me that's the kind of, so I don't know if it's biological. And I don't know any literature. As I said, there's literature about your brain and stuff, and whether it's left and right brain and things like that. There's literature, but it seems to me that science is still nascent. It's still really being developed. But to the extent that it shows differences, it seems to show them more later in terms of the math thing. I don't know. The only thing that makes me think that there's a biological aspect of some of the people-thing dichotomy is the autism spectrum part of it. And saying this, I have two girls. One of them is slightly on the spectrum. We had to teach her to say, she was 3 and 4, if somebody says, how are you? she would get stuck. What am I supposed to say? How am I? I mean, we'd say, no, just say, fine, how are you? So even that can be learned, just like math can be learned. Yeah.
But still, I really, I guess I got a little nervous about turning around this argument and saying that the observation is that there are more women in people-oriented fields, and therefore it must be biological. That just bothered me a little bit.
Oh no, I don't think that that's proof of it. The only thing that I think that shows any proof whatsoever is the autism part of it. Other than that, I don't know. And I think a lot more research has to be done. But the question is, when does it start? It clearly starts very early on, these preferences.
But there are no quantitative
Studies.
that would show clearly one or the other way.
The question is, if they're in high school, that's not good enough. Because by high school, you've already kind of, it's true that whatever you do, I know there's more and more brain, and some people here might be doing it, research saying that what you do over and over again, is what your brain learns. The language you speak before puberty is the one you can speak without, you learn easily and speak without accent. So all of that's happening. So but whether it started as biological or it started by being learned, I don't know. It seems a lot of attitudes are similar in kindergarten, but then there's this autism thing. So I'm not sure. The autism only affects the far, far, far extremes, I would say, in terms of the math ability, not the middle. Did you have a question? Somebody? Yeah. Different ages. I think it should be really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing more of this literature being done and these experiments because, this is just like really suggestive what I said. And if I upset you, what's your first name?
Oh, Vera.
Vera. Oh, I guess we're going to have dinner together. Is that true? So we have plenty of time to talk. Okay. Okay, a little bit more. Okay, child rearing. If you look at some of the evidence about why there's underrepresentation in some fields and not in others, et cetera, there's a lot of impact if you just like control for a family or compare single women and married and women, et cetera. There seems to be some evidence that women's earlier biological clocks and greater family responsibilities drive some of their decisions. In labor economics for the general labor market, a lot has been done recently, especially by Claudia Golden, who's an economic historian, about how women gravitate to fields where time can be flexible and plain, which is to say, I'm a pharmacist, I want the shift that goes from 2 to 8 or 10 or whatever, because my husband can take over the child rearing then, or I want the 8-2 one so I can pick up my kids. So to the extent that you can plan your hours, women gravitate to those fields, whatever they are. And so our work on engineering found that, yeah, women, these bachelors, they do leave engineering more than men. But if you look at why, they're leaving the labor market because they're having kids. And so obviously, even within STEM, PhD STEM people, women leave after PhDs or they don't leave PhD programs more, but they will drop out before going a PhD more or afterward or between PhD and tenure track, dependent on whether they have children or have children soon after. So it's clear that children are dominating some of their choices. It was interesting, we looked at the hours of men and women, and we found that, in fact, men and women with children both work about, I think it was 0.6. These are people working full-time, tenure track or tenure stream faculty. They both work a little less, both men and women. So that's true for both men and women. A little fewer hours. But we do find that, especially in LPS, that women in, like life science, but in general, women are less likely to take tenure track jobs if they have children or postdocs if they have children, or if they have children soon after. So it's clear that this is affecting some of their choices. Yeah. No, but anything. I don't think there is. I think if, in fact, if you look at this versus, like the first study is all in the whole labor market, I don't think there is any difference. I think we do see it among women, even women PhDs. Now, they're much more likely to stay in the labor market and in the, in really full time, because they put in all this investment, into their education. So they're much more likely to stay than generally women in the labor market is. But the fact that they they kind of are also thinking about children, not different. It's not different. It's just, it is also true even among PhD scientists. I think that's maybe surprising, but it's not different. Yeah.
So, one thing that I see, you say both men and women work fewer hours than they have children. The point at which this point is relevant is if fewer hours correlates with less success in academia. From many conversations that I've had with people, and I have done studies, many conversations with people who have kids, they swear by that they're much more efficient.
Oh, yeah, no, I think that they are.
I mean, you're not saying that this is not true, but I'm just pointing it out as,
No, I think that's absolutely true, and it's not so much different hours. Once they're committed to being in tenure stream academia, they cut back maybe 0.6 hours, I think, like of an hour. That's not very much. And you're right. I think that parents are more efficient at using their time. I definitely think that. I'm going to do a few more things about children. Or what? Okay, I'm going to get to that. So I'm going to get to that. Okay. New work that we haven't gotten published yet because we haven't sent it out to a journal yet is about salaries, and we find that in fact women's salaries are. It's not that they're penalized by children. Both women and men are. No, not men. Women are somewhat penalized by children in terms of their salaries, for sure, and not men. This is the weird thing about in general. If you look at men with children, men who are married with children, they make way more than single men. Why? And we call this, in my field, selection. If you can't even get a wife, that's what selection is. So no, people think at least they've done research, not in STEM, but in general in the labor market, at least half of the reason, if not 2/3 of the reason, that men with children and men who are married get paid more is selection. They're different kinds of people. They're more, even, it might be they're more social, who knows, but they're different people, and that's why they get paid more. Anyway, in recent, I'll show you how much career gaps, it does penalize them somewhat, this maternity leave. I'll show you some more. Now, these are not just in academia. What's interesting is that the major reason that women, and I'll show you this picture in a sec, the major reason women get paid less is that in the sciences, is that they're less likely to go into industry. Okay? So it has a lot to do with the sector, and in industry, maternity leave and career gaps are penalized in terms of salary much more than in academia. Academia actually penalizes you much less salary-wise. Anyway, let me just quickly go talk a little bit more about the tenure track academia. We've talked about it some, but I want to talk about including. So by looking at the literature and doing our own stuff, I would say that there's very little bias in tenure track academic hiring, awards to grant applications, publications, so that's our work, the grant thing. This is my co-authors and some other, publication decisions and citations per articles. So like journal publication. So those things do not seem to be affected by gender once you control for other things. So like, for instance, on our NIH, we find that if women who put in an R01 grant, the major grant in bio, were just as likely or to be funded as men. And if you controlled for publications, they were more likely to be funded. Now, and just, I didn't know where to put it, but by the way, the reason that changes is that women publish less. And no one has figured out exactly why, but women publish less than men on average. They get cited the same amount, they publish less. You might think it's they teach too much or they're asked to teach too much, they do too much service. On average, every study finds women publish somewhat less. But there was a difference between men and women, even controlling for publications about whether they ever had an R01, ever had a major grant from the NIH. So their applications were favored, if anything, but they were less likely. Why? Because they applied less. They applied for fewer grants. So these are things, there are differences between men and women, but it's either because of publications or because the women are not applying enough. And that goes back to the literature about women don't ask. So they don't think they're worthy enough, perhaps. I don't know. So, one possibility is that women have a high standard of, on average, a high standard of perfection. I haven't shown, and therefore they hold on to the article until they're really happy. I haven't seen work that shows that, but it might be. So I quickly, let's see how much time I have. No time. So I gave you some, CVs here. Just quickly look at it. And I set up these polls, but I talked too much. So I don't think we have time to do the polls. So online, we can maybe do it later. But if you look at them, these are the actual CVs from 2 studies that showed very different things. The first 2 CVs show are for a tenure track job, and the second CV is for a lab manager, and these were done by different researchers. So, if you have Lisa and James, the question is, who would you hire? And I think we don't have time to do this. Maybe I'll have you all go take these home with you and think. So the first 2 are what one of the hiring studies did. They showed this to actual faculty in top universities and said, would you hire these people? And the only difference was the gender. In fact, you have different sets of CVs with the genders changed. Okay? The other one, the lab manager, also they gave the exact same CVs, changing the names. So for the job, a lab manager, this was a faculty choosing a grad student, I think, to run their lab. They chose men more. The second one about hiring tenure track people, they chose women more, except for what field? Economics. Okay? But all the other fields were more likely to choose the identical woman. All the other of these 3, biology, engineering, and psychology. So, there are these 2 studies, and assuming they're both good, the second one had more different ways of looking at it and more observations. But yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh.
But I was going to ask about the experiments done for tenure track hiring, so hiring at the assistant professor level.
Yeah.
I'd be really curious to see what the difference is for hiring at a full tenure position with equal CVs. You know what I mean?
That would be very interesting.
Sometimes get the sense that women are invited onto the tenure track to help.
Okay, so I'll give you a little, I haven't seen that hiring, but I talk about tenure promotion in 1 sec. But I think the difference between these 2 studies are that in the tenure track, they have a track record. You look at their publications first, you look at their presentations, you look at if they have a postdoc, you look at their grants if they have it, and there's more to go on. That's really, they've done more, and so, yeah. But Okay. So I know in the first one, they were told that they're going to use these they're supposed to say, how would you rate this? And to use these for the students, the actual graduate students, not women or men separately, but the actual graduate students to see if they, how they could improve their CVs or improved, their chances of getting jobs. Like, so what's important to you? How could, and in the second one, they also didn't know it was gender. I'm trying to remember what it was, and I can't remember what it was, but they did not think it was gender. And there were usually two men and one woman, or usually 2 men and 1 woman, so that woman didn't and one of them was thrown out, that one of the men was just there to confuse them. So they tried not to have it be about women. Okay, so I find this really interesting. This is NAS data also about hiring. And this is tenure track position. It's assistant professor. So these are the percentage of female applicants, which can be pretty low. This is, of those, the percentage invited to interview. These are all higher than this. And this is, of these, how many were offered the position. These are all higher than this. And let me emphasize electrical engineering, which has very few women. Okay, if you applied, you were much more likely to get interviewed and then really more likely to get hired. So this suggests, and perhaps it's this thing about women, we want women, but we don't want them too high. But this suggests that, if anything, people are using their own personal affirmative action. However, promotion to tenure is a mixed bag. Now, of course, economics is bad. That goes without saying. But also life sciences and psychology are bad. So I have my notes there. I think economics, this is work that we've done, the controlling for everything, women were 19% percentage points less likely to get tenure percentage points out of about 60 or so average. And life sciences, it was smaller. It was like 9%, I'm sorry. And psychology, it was somewhere between maybe 12%. But these are big percentage points differences in the likelihood of getting tenure. However, in many of these fields, we did not find a statistical difference. And in fact, in engineering and in the other social sciences besides economics and psychology, we found that the likelihood was slightly higher for women, but not significantly so. So, in fact, promotion in some fields is very, very bad, and I can tell you why economics might be different. I can't explain the life sciences and psychology, except that maybe they're dominated by women and people do affirmative action for the men. I'm not sure. Do you know, like among the younger ones? Mm-hmm. The predominant. For men, oh yeah, and teaching and principal, the whole thing, right. So, but that's also true in academia. This is my recent work about salaries, and if you just look here, this is the total salary, gender salary gap, more than 16%, but you can account for it by a lot of things, especially the sector that you're working. Industry women are not. This is the unexplained, that we can't explain by these other things. These are all PhDs working full time. And I don't have time to go into it, but what disturbs me the most is that it was better 10 years before. There was a smaller gap and a smaller unexplained gap. So there is a salary gap there. So if I go back to my original main conclusions, I still come back that I'm the most worried about this part, about what happens when you're really young. But that doesn't mean that you guys are off the hook, which is to say, you are not giving people, tenure in some fields. You are not paying them as much. So it suggests a bunch of things. Yes?
I had a comment about the study about fat second point.
Only
you know,
in
based
US.
on US population relevant for us who are mostly international. So, you know, in Serbia, one observation that I have is that my class in astrophysics was 75% girls. And all of these people, all of my classmates continued on to PhDs and successfully completed their PhDs and are now postdocs. This is a single data point, I agree, but still, you know, it just makes me wonder, you know, this is a problem in this country and probably many other countries, but is this really, you know, to what
Is it,
extent is this?
is it widespread? I think, I'm going back to what I said before. I think the fact that so many, you know, differences in measured abilities between boys and girls, that's that's a product of how they were taught to begin with, and their attitude, their learned attitudes in kindergarten. And so, you're right, and I'm saying, so I think that in the case where there are, like Iceland, obviously they're being taught, their whole attitudes toward gender is very different in kindergarten and first grade. Because you couldn't have the advantage for girls if you believe that if girls can't do math.
So I think bottom line that I wanted to comment here is that I agree that this is really interesting and a big problem in the society, but I don't think it lets us off the hook with the percentage that you might conclude, you know, by just propagating that onto, you know.
Oh, I don't think it, right, and I don't think it lifts, you being the academia and kind of the later stages, I don't think you're off the hook because of the later one. So it suggests a lot of several different things. I could talk about them, but I just wanted to know before I get cut off, how did you guys do? Do you believe that women can't do science? And I had a poll, but I don't have time to do it. So I made this whole poll, but I don't have time to do it. So kind of, where were you? If you had a chance, what this does is it has these words, female and male and science and liberal arts, and you had to associate it and how fast you could answer it, and whether you answered it correctly. Both of those affected this. So I'll just say that last week I had little to no preference, but this is not the first time I did the test. So 2 times ago, I had a slight automatic, and I'm not sure what I was when I first did the test. So it's hard to get it right, even if you know what they're testing for, and you do. But did anybody get as well as I did this time when I took it for the 4th time of little to no automatic preferences? You did? Well, because you come from Serbia.
I was preferring female scientists, moderately preferring female scientists, and I think that's a result of.
I think that's great. I think that's great. I wonder if we could study where you're from and get the URLs. I think that would be an interesting way to study it. Cool. Yeah.
I got the no preference. I was also born in Serbia, I guess.
Either that or you had wonderful education or have a wonderful significant other. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's hard if you look at the actual percentages, and this is last week, and this is it seems to be getting a little better, but maybe there are more people like me. But it's also relatively stable. That there are far more people in the top 3 than anywhere else, and it's something that you should know about yourself. And try, as I said in the next steps, when you teach people, just say, women, men, they can equally learn, and even if they don't know it now, they can learn it. That's what you really have to do, is get teachers to be convinced that math can be learned, and then it will be learned. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.